In order to address the science-religion debate across the board, almost any topic, the first place you have to start is how do we interpret Scripture? In fact, if I teach courses on religion and science at Fuller Seminary, I require the students to have had at least one course in Old Testament study so that they will not be naive in the reading strategies that they bring when they think about the scriptural texts. In terms of the interpretation of Scripture, I think I would want to start, first of all, by calling into question a sharp distinction between a literal reading and whatever else there is. The very notion of a literal reading is kind of a modern reaction against other forms of interpretation, and I don't think it's a category that even would have occurred to the mind of any of the biblical authors. So it's very much a late development in Western history, even to have the category of literal. But that doesn't answer the question of what the Genesis stories are. And remember that there are two creation stories there. So my preferred term for those stories is that they are narrative theology. And again, that's imposing a very contemporary term, but I think that helps to convey their content and purpose better than to argue about literal versus mythological or whatever. There wasn't any vocabulary, there wasn't any conceptual scheme in which to write the kind of creation theology that contemporary Christians write today. So what language are you going to use in order to talk about who created, the nature of the Creator, the goodness of the creation, the place of humankind in the creation, and all of those theological topics. And the obvious literary resources in those days were stories. And so these are theological stories intended as a way to teach theological truths about God and creation. I'm sure that it sounds frightening to some people when I say that I'm comfortable with the creation stories not being historical in the sense that we would mean today, because that's one way of saying that they're not true, but that's saying that they're not true on a certain level. It's not to say that they're not true in any sense, because, as I would want to emphasize, they're intending to teach theological truths. And if they're in the Bible, then they are inspired by God. They're not just any stories that anyone could make up. So if you are a Christian, if you are a Jew, and you believe that the Scriptures are inspired by God, then you are committed to the theological truth that they convey. One of the things that puzzles me about the evolution-creation controversy is the extent to which it's focused on the Old Testament. I believe that we can't understand the New Testament without it. Jesus wouldn't have understood who he was without it, and so on. So it's extremely important. But Christian scripture starts with Christian texts, and primarily among those texts are the Gospels. Even though they're not the oldest, these are the ones that give us the most direct picture of who Jesus was, what he was teaching, and what he was doing. And so I would like people who are concerned about the literal truth of the Bible to start with the Sermon on the Mount. And when they've worked through that one and lived accordingly, then we'll go back and we'll talk about the literal truth of Genesis.